together, and one of the problems, as we saw, was that they doesn't really seem to fit, which is very strange, because, as I said, introducing this, the possibility that commissioning a major, I mean, there's nothing like this in all of Northern Europe up until this point, unless lots of things have been destroyed that we don't know about. So this is the biggest thing ever. You're not going to just borrow bits and pieces from here and there. As we saw, maybe for City Hall, maybe organ shutters, maybe a separate thing in the middle here, and maybe the last minute, what will I put in the little skinny spaces, Adam and Eve. Doesn't make sense. So, I mean, there's never going to be an easy answer. The only way we'll get answers is when they invent time machines, and we can go back and ask Jan van Eyck himself, what the hell are you doing? So apart from that, we just go, well, I do think that also make art a little bit more interesting sometimes, so that's good. But also the sort of slight inconsistency of style. I mean, everybody says, well, this is all kind of one style, one artist for sure. But then some of the figures in particular, they seem a little bit old-fashioned to me, somehow. There are bits in here, I mean, if you remember some of these areas, I mean, that's incredibly old-fashioned, all these people lined up with their heads in a straight line. And, yeah, so the point is just an inconsistency apart from anything else. And how much would it actually be painted by Jan and or Hubert, the older brother? I think Jan had something like 12 assistants working for him, so there's a whole little army and assembly line of people all slapping paint onto things. So, I mean, he does the finishing off. It's his design. But I mean, an artist like Rubens, for example, who you probably know in the 17th century, he would do sketches and drawings, hand them over to the assembly line, who would blow them up big to 18 feet high. He comes along, touches them up, signs them, collects the money. And people say, oh, it's not very good, it's not. But it kind of is, because first of all, there's no way you could be as prolific as he was without all that help. Also, I say, it's like an architect, he designs the building, he doesn't lay the bricks. And so many people were so well qualified at this time, technically. And Rubens had people working on, like Franz Snijders, Van Dyck. I mean, all sorts of the sort of next generation of great Flemish painters all worked for him. So it's not like they're just kind of hack artists. So again, it's the concept, it's the idea that matters, I suppose, in a case like that. Anyway, I mean, there's all sorts of complex. I mean, in a second-year term paper, you're not going to solve the problem, probably. So I wouldn't worry about it too much. But it does add another little degree of interest to the thing. So we didn't quite finish it. We got to almost to the end with the adoration of the mystic lamb. And well, one of the, again, I'm not sure if I emphasize it quite that much, but just the idea of perspective, because I mentioned that this is, in the North they're not that cared about scientific analysis of space or anything like that. So you just get the idea, people get a bit smaller as they go away, but there's not much sense of real depth. You get a bit of colour coding off to the far distance there. But basically there's about the same amount of detail as there is in this area as there is in that area. And some of the trees and the architectural bit, they kind of suck things up to the front of the picture in a way. So a real space, and even the fact that he's got a kind of double viewpoint, because as I said, the altar, we see it from sort of fairly low down, but this fountain thing here, the kind of fountain of life, we've actually gone up a bit looking down into it. So again, he's just mucking about with space in that way, but as opposed to a very few years earlier in Florence, I showed you this one, Masaccio, who is, along with Brunelleschi, who was the great architect, and Donatello, who was the great sculptor, they're developing, they want to almost replicate this world, the real world, rather than create a sort of spiritual equivalent, I guess you could say. So for that you need the tools, and that's why you have scientific perspective, and to begin with it's very pedantic in a way. It's only because one of the problems with one-point perspective is that we've got two eyes. So it never quite works, it's too rigid. But if you draw the lines along the architectural bits here, as I said, I think they all line up at Christ's left ear. And so that's linear perspective. And area of perspective is where things just change colours and fade off a little bit as you go off into the distance. So there's a very different approach. One is analysis, and another is just looking at and responding to. Because if you actually looked at all the small details here, it's that kind of combination of naturalism, real observation of things. Because all the flowers I want to bring down, but some of them are almost textbook and things like that. And then you get the artificiality of the scene as well that adds up together. So that's, anyway, and we saw all the kind of the millions of people who are, it's like an All Saints feast day accumulation of all these various Old Testament, New Testament, males, females. So not to go back through that again, but what we didn't get to quite were the wings down at the bottom. And again, when you look at that, it's sort of a separate thing, isn't it? And I did mention that in 1425, Hubert van Eyck, why they bothered to write about it, I'm not quite sure, but he visited City Hall, and maybe to discuss a contract for the painting of this particular altar. Because as we'll see, there's one bit that kind of doesn't fit in some ways, because everybody else is holy or unholy in the whole picture. Anyway, what we see, working our way across, because they're all heading in towards the middle, because that's where salvation is. That's what we're all interested in these pictures, is the next life, going to heaven. But I think I mentioned that even the inscription on the frame that's lost, that I mentioned, it has a lot to do with the saying of prayers for the soul of Josvite and his wife, the fellow who painted it. Yeah?
You know, he said that one was redone.
Huh?
You know, he said that like one.
Wait a minute. Just be patient. All will be explained.
Okay.
Haven't quite got there yet. Too keen. No, that's a good thing. So, and I mean, in the private chapel, see, they didn't have any children, this couple. So, one of the things you have to pay for when you sort of rent the chapel, if you like, in the church, you pay for monks to come along and say prayers for your soul. And the more monks pray for you, the quicker you get to heaven, basically. It's that simple. It's sort of a cash value. So that's the idea of salvation, next world, immortal life, behave yourself. So the far right hand, you have, I did the other order, it doesn't really matter. These are the pilgrims. And pilgrims, well, we're coming out of the great age of pilgrimages, really. But pilgrimages are wonderful things that got, if you were bad, you got sent off to go somewhere to visit one of the holy shrines. And it was the whole cult of relics, and it was an enormous business to keep people moving around in Europe at this time. So the pilgrims are shown here as well. The giant figure in the front, and don't worry about all the individual stuff, but that's St. Christopher, who was, I mentioned when we saw St. Veronica, which means Vera, icon, the true image of Christ, because she has the big hanky, you remember? Christopher, by legend, he carried baby Jesus across the river, and he's this giant of a man. Christopheros, Christ carrier, basically his name means. So that's him at the front. The only other chapter to worry about a little bit, to be interested in, is, see, there's a fellow with a shell on his hat. And that would be St. James. One of the main goals of the pilgrim, because it was quite calculated in a way, because you either went to the Holy Land, that was too far and it was too dangerous, or you went to Rome. And so that was good for people on the way to Rome, but I think they figured that if they had another major centre, they could split people up and have them going to the other side of Europe, and that would kind of spread the wealth a bit. So they discovered amazing how it happened, the relics of St. James in Santiago de Compostela, which is way up northwestern Spain, about almost as far across as you can get away from Rome. And that was the other, and that's still a famous thing to do. If you can sign up and go on the pilgrimage, follow the pilgrimage route to Santiago. It must be quite fun to do. And there are still lots of lovely little churches along the way that, time has passed by, that sort of thing, nice little Romanesque buildings. Anyway, the shell on his hat is the symbol of the pilgrim, and that would be like the badge that you got for going on the pilgrimage. You collect all these little badges to show you've been there. And the shell also, that particular kind of shell, any Christian seeing that would think of baptism, because it's kind of like the thing that you pour water over babies with during the baptism ritual. So you get a sort of little double bit of meaning there. The other lot here, these are the hermits. And again, doesn't really matter who they are, but these are the hairy, smelly people. Look at them, because they all live in the desert, and they shouldn't all be a gang of hermits like that. So they've just been sort of put together, because hermits are supposed to live in separate deserts, basically. But I think I did mention this in passing, that there are two ladies. When you look at the picture, they sort of jump out a little bit, those ladies. And it really looks to me like they've been added in, almost as an afterthought. And I remember Elizabeth Bourlou, the wife of Josvite, and who looked like such a tough, sort of feminist lady. I bet she looked at this and said, we need some women, put them in there. And so that's, one of them is, there were two famous women hermits. One was Mary Magdalene, who ended up in France living in the desert, and the other one was Mary of Egypt. And that's these. Mary, if you know the story, because these are all, remember, the attributes that usually have something to do with their life. It was at a wedding feast where Mary showed up and washed Christ's feet and sort of dried them with her, washed them with her tears, basically, and dried them with her hair, and put precious ointment on his feet. And all the disciples said, well, look, come on, we could spend all this money on feeding the poor. And Christ said, I kind of like this, leave her alone. It's one of those odd little stories. But again, if you're interested at all in Mary Magdalene, she's one of the great mystery people in the Bible who was, there's no way of telling exactly who she was, because there are two Marys. It was probably in about the 6th century, I never remember when it was. Gregory the Great decided that, because he was pushing the sacraments, and one of the sacraments is penance, which is being sorry for your sins. So he sort of needed a poster child, somebody with a lot of sins. So he created the idea that Mary Magdalene was a prostitute, all the kind of horrors around her, and nothing about that in the Bible whatsoever. So she is the prostitute with all, the great sinner of all time, and then that means she's got lots to be sorry for. But her attribute is the ointment jar. We'll meet her again, holding that thing. That's what she washes or puts on Christ's feet. Anyway, they're kind of a nice looking bunch. They're rather good, all these characters here, nicely sort of individualized. They all look kind of exotic. So when we pop over to the other side, what we have are, these are essentially the Knights of Christ. And it's kind of like, good old days of chivalry and almost international Gothic style, but these are, again, flesh and blood creatures. There are a number of Christian saints who fought the good fight, basically, for Christ. So people like St. George and the soldier knights, St. George and St. Sebastian, these are all have their wonderful legends around them, and they are legends, really. Even St. George, almost the most famous of all of Christian early saints, has been sort of struck off as being mythological rather than real. Don't think it really matters somehow. Anyway, that's them in the front, and then they're all sort of nicely, big hats and crowns and everything else. Oh, beautiful rocky landscapes as well, that's rather good. And then the final panel is, now see, this is the one that doesn't belong by subject matter, because everybody else I said in the picture was her, except for this lot, and they are the just judges. And then that makes you think of City Hall and the idea that being a good judge might be a good thing at this time. And so these are presumably portraits of actual people. I think it's that one who's said to be a portrait of Jan van Eyck himself, maybe that one. I don't believe that, because that's what people say. The artists always sort of stick themselves in somewhere. Anyway, this is the one that creates a little bit of a, they're just not quite right in this particular context, which is why people think that at least the bottom part was done for City Hall. So this is the one, this is what you were sort of mentioning, was that this is the one that was stolen in 1934. And whoever stole it also, because if you think of the overall format of the thing, there would be another panel on the back of this, and I think it was either John the Baptist or John the Evangelist, got that one too. Returned that just to prove that they had this one, and then hung on to it, and then dropped dead. Whoever had it, he didn't live very long. That'll teach you. So anyway, that was the big mystery. But you could Google it, because there are all sorts of conspiracy theories and clues and everything else about exactly what went on. And a copy was put in place of the original, made in the 1940s, I think. But never ever when you're looking at the picture, unless somebody points it out, you think, oh, that's awful, that's a copy. So it does blend in rather nicely. But, I mean, they're still looking for the original. So there are a lot of people who still think it's hanging around somewhere. In fact, I heard that they were... See, it's painted on wood, so it's not like metal. You can go around with a metal detector and find it somewhere. But apparently they're going through the whole cathedral in Ghent, sort of with some sort of sonar, something or other, behind wood. I mean, how do you find a piece of wood behind wood paneling? That would be tricky. Anyway, they think he might never have taken it out of the church, this fellow, and just sort of stashed it somewhere. There's another theory which I just heard that... Remember last time when I was introducing this, I showed they're restoring the whole thing hugely, taking it all apart and cleaning it up, putting it back together again. They're going to do a great deal of tests on this particular panel, because there is also a theory that it's actually the original. That when they put the copy in, it wasn't a copy at all, it was the real one, they just snuck it back in, but they told everybody it was a copy for some stupid reason. So the test that they can do, obviously you can analyze paint, and it's very obvious it's from the 15th century or the 20th century. So that'll be interesting when they come up with those conclusions. So look out for the big headlines. It'll be, what is it? You never hear about these things, because it's not, for the rest of the world, it's not all that interesting, I guess. Anyway, it just adds another little piece of